This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Have you noticed on this podcast, traders, psychologists, and older guys are the most interesting? Now, don't get me wrong. So many people come on this show and have some cool piece of research, some insight they've figured out. But sometimes they're kind of like meat and potatoes, a little boring. It requires a lot of energy from me to make them shine. I'm not being cocky. I'm just pretty good at this stuff now. But what I love is when I don't have to do too much. You get a guest on who just shines. You just wind them up and they go. And I love that. I get energized. Not only do you learn something new that you've never thought about, or they have a perspective that you have never imagined, they just do something to you. These people have something, either due to their experience, their age. I don't know what it is. And as a show like this gets bigger and bigger and bigger, I sometimes like to, as you might guess, reach back into the archives and pull forward some guest episodes that you may not have heard or you forgot about. Today is one of those days. My first guest, and the name will come in the introduction when the episode starts playing, but my first guest studies mental model theory, all about our human memory, cognition. Absolutely such an interesting perspective. Because what he talks about happens to me a lot, and I hate it when it happens. But again, like my introduction, I love these types of individuals. People just turned on by their stuff, and they just dig and they dig and they dig, and then when you talk to them, they shine it right back. My second guest, something you might call management theory. That sounds really boring. He's not, though. He's one of those older guys I mentioned. He sold over 60 books, 13 million copies in print. So he kind of knows what he's doing when it comes to being an author. Without any further delay, let me jump right in and give you a cool Back to the Future rewind of two very, very interesting guests. Oh, hold on one second. Before we go back there, what's the COVID update? The Corona update? Because for all you know, I'm not really in May of 2020 recording this, but I am. The Corona update? Come on. It's all politics now. We know that Corona is a disease that doesn't like modernity. It doesn't like old folks. It doesn't like folks that are not in shape. It doesn't like bad immune systems. It's a really shitty disease. It's killing a lot of people, but it's not killing all of us. So I guess the fun that will come, the debate that will come, the politics that will come, how much will government try to save us versus how much will government not try to save us? That's it. We all know that's it. Let's just sit back, grab some popcorn, and see what happens next, because we sure as hell can't control it. Now, without any further delay, let's jump right into those two rewind guests for today. My guest today, Gabriel Radvansky. He's a professor specializing in cognition, brain, and behavior. His research is focused on the development of mental model theory for human memory and cognition. Mental models, look, just a person's representation of a situation they experienced, read, or heard about. His research is aimed at understanding how people create, organize, store, and retrieve mental models. And he has some especially interesting research into the issue of walking through doors and forgetting. When you walk through a door and you forget what you were just thinking when you go into the next room, it's a touch more complicated than perhaps you've ever thought about. Let's jump right in today to my guest, Gabriel Radvansky. In advance of our call, I started thinking about architecture, which is probably not a surprising thing to say given your work. And so I started thinking about one thing in particular that's kind of close to my heart. I started thinking about Wall Street trading floors. And Wall Street trading floors for years have been these open air environments, people sitting side by side, very not closed in, not walled off. These guys got all the money in the world. They could be in their own little private offices. Why do they have to be next to each other? But going through your world, I'm starting to think to myself, have some of these folks figured your work out, maybe not scientifically, but maybe just kind of realized over the years that their productivity, hence involving their cognition, their memory, was increased when they're in these open air environments versus closed environments?
Yeah, I can see. I haven't thought about it in terms of that particular example. Clearly, when you don't have to switch from one event to another, you can hang on to some of the information. Thinking about that example, what your idea of a location is and what your idea of an event is much more fluid. You can either have the location just be you at your particular spot right there, or you can expand out to something larger. So, thinking about my office here, I can be sitting here in front of the computer, or I can be over up to the side at the table, or I could be, those be two different locations, or I can be in my office, which is one location. And that's one of the advantages of the whole event cognition approach. It's the advantage and it's a disadvantage in that the definition of what is a location, what is an event is kind of fluid, kind of slippery. That's apparently how cognition works, that we can switch between different levels pretty easily.
I'm jumping in here right off the bat with that example, but for our audience, I should probably let you take it a little bit from the top. A little inside baseball here. And what we're really talking about is this classic conundrum that we've all experienced that you've really figured out, which is, why does walking through doors just throw us for a loop? Happens to me all the time. I'll be in one room and I've got the great thought, the brilliant thought. Look, I'm a guy that writes things. I walk into the next room and I'm like, where the hell did it go?
Yeah, exactly. I think most people think about it in terms of the disadvantage. Why is that a problem? Why does that happen? Why do I forget these things when I walk through doorways? But I think of that more as an advantage, because if you think about the environment, when you go from one environment to another, you don't want to carry the stuff from the previous environment into the new environment. So what you do in a forest may be different from what you need to do when you walk into a meadow. And so you need to leave some things behind and pick up on new things. I think it comes into play in terms of the architecture of the buildings that we build, bringing up your previous point, that the reason we have different rooms and doorways separating between rooms is because we do different things in those places. And you usually want to leave behind what you're doing in one place to pick up what you're going to be doing in the new place. And that's, I think, an advantage. So that's why I think that happens.
Why don't you define event boundary? You brought it up there in the beginning, but I should probably let you define it and let people understand where you're coming from.
An event boundary is something that defines an event. For us, events have a lot of components. Events occur in some spatial temporal framework. So that means the location that you're in, so the spatial boundaries, whatever it is you're at, a room or an outdoor area or whatever it may be. And the temporal boundary is the beginning and end of some coherent sequence of actions, such as watching a movie or having a phone call or whatever it may be. So that's the container, the spatial temporal framework. Within that framework are entities, and the most important entities for us are people. but they could be other things. They could be objects or things of that nature. Each of those entities has properties. It can be something very physical, like how something looks or how something sounds, or it can be something more innate, such as some internal state or some goal or things of that nature. And the fourth component is that those entities within that spatial temporal framework have interrelations amongst one another. It could be spatial relations, it could be social relations, it could be ownership relations, any of those kind of things. And then finally, each of those spatial temporal frameworks can be joined by temporal sequences or causal sequences, where you have cause and effect. So that's kind of how we think about events. Now, an event boundary is whenever any major shift occurs in any of those elements. So most of the work that you've been thinking about, and that probably gets most of our time talking about, are spatial shifts, going from one region to another. So when you change that spatial temporal framework, change that setting from one place to another place, we call that a spatial boundary. Now you can have other kinds of boundaries as well. So you can have a temporal shift. You're watching a movie, and suddenly there's a big jump in time, either forwards or backwards or what have you. That would be an event boundary. Or a major character walks into a room or walks out of a room. Then that's another event boundary because you're changing the entities that are involved, things of that nature. Does that give you a better idea about what an event boundary is?
Yeah. Because I'm just getting people to grasp the idea of like, look, we instinctively have all experienced the walking through the door and forgetting. You've broken this down at a very granular level. So I just wanted people to have a framework to understand where you're coming from.
Yep, that's kind of the basics of it.
Let me let you go back in time a little bit, though, because before we start to flesh out things, I would love for you to go back in time, because this is a terribly interesting direction you've gone down. We take for granted these things, and we really don't ever get under the surface, but you've gotten under the surface. What was the moment for you where you said, oh my gosh, memory, cognition, I'm going down this path? What age were you when you started to say, this is it, I love this, this is my passion, I'm going this way? Was there some kind of moment for you that really triggered you, your passion?
Yeah, it was my first day of introductory psychology. I don't know. Something about Ben Wallace, my introductory psych teachers. It was clear to me that all the questions I'd sort of been asking in my head could be answered from that perspective. So as a cognitive psychologist, like a lot of cognitive psychologists, I come from psychology from a sort of a different angle. So my original major in college was physics, and then I went to computer science because I liked the whole AI thing, and then I got into psychology because it was really getting at the questions about what is thinking, what is the mind, how does it all work. It's a little bit different from a lot of psychologists who want to be helpers, who want to be clinicians and things like that. So it's a little bit different kind of psychology. I guess I'm the more nerdy guy in a lab coat with the rats in the maze kind of approach to things. So that's kind of how I got involved in it. My college grades were average, and after I got into this, they just sort of took off. So clearly that was an indicator to me that this is what I should be doing. And I've been doing it ever since, and everything's good.
Was there any particular, you mentioned that first class, was there anything, a particular example, something the professor said, something that sticks as color in your memory that really pushed you, or is it just the overall experience?
I think it was just the overall experience, just his first day description about what a psychologist is, what a psychologist does, sent me over the edge. I was at a sort of a loss of what to do. I'd taken the previous quarter off because I didn't feel like I was going anywhere. And this was actually in the summer, coming back to school, and everything just opened up for me. Everything just was timed perfectly. I was ready to receive that.
I would love to go back into the history of memory research, and for you to perhaps lay some of that foundation for some of the early pioneers. I've read some names, but is there a particular pioneer where we can really look at, say, okay, that it really started there, and perhaps knowing that it started there and then kind of trace some of the evolution to where we are today?
Well, it all started with Hermann Ebbinghaus and the publication of his book in 1885, looking at memory. That was very early on. He basically wanted to study memory, and what he thought was the pure form by memorizing long lists of nonsense syllables, so consonant, vowel, consonant trigrams that have no meaning in the language. In his case, it was German, because he was German. From that, we derived some basic principles of memory, such as the forgetting curve, the idea that you lose information over time, and this goes in a regular way. It's proportional loss over time. That's kind of started it all. Memory from that point had fits and starts. There was what we call the behaviorist era in psychology, where you give guys running rats and mazes and things of that nature. And then memory didn't really take off as a topic of study per se in force until probably the early 1960s, where people started using the invention of the modern digital computer as an analogy for how the mind works, which makes sense because engineers were designing computers the way that they thought the mind worked. We were using this device to serve as an analogy for how we think that human memory works. So we've got this long-term memory, which would be like your hard drive. We've got your working memory, is what you're currently thinking about, so that should be like your RAM, and things of that nature, and looking at how the computer accesses information and using that as a guideline to look at how we access information from our own memories. The way of thinking about studying cognition and memory is, as psychologists and other cognitive scientists, we're trying to reverse engineer the mind. We're giving people information, we're seeing what comes out on the other side, and trying to figure out what's going on in between. The same way an engineer might try to reverse engineer some device that he can't actually get into to figure out how it's working and what it's doing. That's kind of where we are.
As you bring up that example with the early pioneers in computing technology, they're thinking of how the mind works. Given that basic, and we can all kind of think about the basic operations of a typical computer, hard drive, RAM, etc., how closely do we think we are in terms of understanding? Because I know there's been some over the years, and I believe some thought where, okay, there's some silos here, so to speak. I'm using my own jargon, but then hold on, memory's everywhere and then it's nowhere. But then I guess some of the newer research would say, hold on, there is a regional component. Can you elaborate there to give people a better handle on what's going on?
In terms of how we represent memories?
In terms of the storage of memories, what we know about that. And you brought up the idea of the early computing and what scientists thought our minds were working like, and say, oh, this design computers like what we think our minds are operating. Were we close at all?
Yes and no. What's sort of guiding the way we think about memories is what has been called a literacy metaphor. That memories are like pages or like books that they're sort of discrete and they're there as a whole. And that's not how it works at all. I mean, our memories are very fluid, very flexible. So we're basically still at the very early stages, just trying to quantify the characteristics of memories, what their shape is and how they can alter themselves as need be, depending on the demands that the person is dealing with at the moment. Several decades ago, there was this push to shift from the computer metaphor to what they call the brain metaphor, where memories are in the connections among the neurons. And nobody really knows what pattern of connections would correspond to a given memory, or how big a memory is, how many neurons a given memory might require to represent, a trip to the beach or something like that. We're just not there yet. We're still at the level of trying to figure out what the various components of the brain do and how those are involved in the processing of information. Let me give you an example here of what I'm talking about. This builds on some of my more recent work. So I told you before about back in 1885, Ebbinghaus had this forgetting curve, which is this negatively accelerating function. So basically, the more time that's passed, the more information that's lost in a proportional sense. So, and people thought for over 100 years that it was just sort of this continuous process. The more time that's passed, the further away you get, the less you're able to access that information. And what I've been finding is that isn't completely true. One of the things that I've found that's been particularly striking to me and to people I've been telling about is that there is this gradual loss of information that sort of levels off until about a week, about 7 days later, and then it gets worse again. So it's like there are these two phases of memory retention where people are losing information, it levels off, and then after about 7 days, it starts picking up again. So it's like this two-phase process, which most people didn't notice that because they were looking at very short-term or very long-term, and nobody really looking at something that spanned that. So that's why I don't think that was discovered. And that's interesting in terms of how information is represented in the brain and the mind, is because that sort of maps onto one of the things that we think about is going on in terms of the long-term storage of information. So the idea is that initially the hippocampus is very involved in retaining and holding on to information, but the very long-term representation of the information is going to be beyond that and sort of stored cortically more broadly. And the idea is that 7 days is when information is being held or maintained in the hippocampus, and that after that period of time, those memories become disrupted. And so what you're left with is just the cortex. And what we're seeing behaviorally is something that maps onto this neurological shift. And I think this is also something that people in their everyday experience have some sort of intuition about. So in experimental psychology, we are very clear to define what we call short-term memory as being something that lasts 30 to 60 seconds, things that you're actually thinking about. But that's not how people use that term typically in their everyday conversation. When people are saying they're having short-term memory problems, they can't remember things over the short term, they're usually talking about something that's a much longer period of time. I have some data that I actually collected last week showing that tends to map onto the 7-day shift, that most people, when they use it from short-term memory, they're talking about a few days. And if you ask them to give a number, the average of that is pretty close to 7 plus or minus 2 days at which they can remember things. So just like people have that everyday experience of walking through a doorway causes forgetting, they also have this sort of everyday intuition about the shift and the change in the nature of our long-term memories. And that's sort of getting at the representation of things. How are things being represented in different parts of the brain over different periods of time for different purposes?
I've got a great example. At least I think it's a great example. It's very personal to me. I want to share it with you just to get some feedback. I'm sure you've heard these stories many times. You just said that, we've got this intuitive feel about things. And, you said, well, the more time that's passed, we're less able to access, and that's not necessarily true. I should share with you, in the last 5 years, I've had a chance to spend most of my time in Asia. It's been an interesting experience, relationships, ups and downs, all that kind of stuff. Fantastic exposure to different things. But over time, it starts to dull. That's one point. The second point, 10 years ago, I had a book come out, a true story about a trading story. Both of these events, the living in Asia and this trading story, both have inspired me this year to develop film scripts. And what's been amazing to me is that when I like to say this kind of intensity and passion hits, things from my memory that I don't know where they are coming from appear. And they weren't appearing before the project started. They really weren't like jumping out at me. I wasn't thinking about them on a daily basis. But when the words start to appear on the page and you start to fill in the blanks, it's phenomenal to me that things start to appear out of nowhere. The trading script, I hired an LA screenwriter. She comes up with a first draft, and it was based on my book. I look at it, it was great structurally, but she can't be expected to have the same level of detail that I know about the story. When I saw her script, it was like I would see a line and all of a sudden I'd be like, oh my gosh, that line she wrote is okay, but my memory puts this instantly there and it's 10 times better. And she agrees with me. And she's probably thinking, where did that even come from? And I'm not sure where it even came from.
That's one of the things that's really fascinating about memory. So one of the things that's frustrated me about the scientific study of memory is that it tends to focus on relatively short-term things that are hard to remember. Well, I think that comes from education. Education is basically focused on trying to learn things that are hard to remember. There's a lot of things that we learn at a high level of detail very, very quickly that are stored very, very well. And the example I always use is Netflix. So your favorite show comes on Netflix, it's released, the whole season's there, you binge watch it, and then you don't see another episode for like a year or more, right? That next season starts, you have no trouble remembering basically what's going on. You've forgotten a few details here and there, but you basically have a good grasp of what's happening and why it's happening, things of that nature. And I think that's basically how our memories are working in our everyday experiences, that we're encoding, consolidating, and storing high levels of information. So when I look at memories for things that people learn in the lab, they forget those things very quickly. Lists of words and sentences, it's gone within a few minutes or hours or days or what have you. But other things tend to hang on for long periods of time. So memories for films or books or life experiences, there's some forgetting there, but the forgetting is much, much more shallow. The rate of forgetting is much, much more gradual. That's, I think, an important thing that we really need to start looking at. And it's hard to do that because you have to wait very long periods of time to assess these things. And you're not going to get tenure if you're waiting 10 years to test somebody's memory. An important thing to keep in mind about memory, and this is very, very important. I tell this to my students the first day of class, is that memory is not about the past. We don't have memories so we can think about things that happened in the past. We have memories so that we know what to do right now and we know what to do in the future. And we draw upon our experiences of the past to help us what we're doing now and to help us doing things that we're going to be ready to be successful in the future. So when you talk about these things coming to mind that you haven't thought about in years, generally, whatever the cues are that are available to you at the moment, they're very diagnostic. And so they're picking out those memories perfectly.
That's a great example. In my situation, you're right. The writing from this other person, it was a cue that then smacked me in the head and said, boom, like that. I used two words with you. I said kind of my intuitive feel would be when things happen with me that involve a certain intensity or passion, I find my memories are spurred even more. But the better word to use really might be the emotion of it. When the emotion hits, that's when, boom, it's go time and it comes back instantly.
Yeah, our memories are, I talked about the hippocampus. Another structure that's really associated with that is the amygdala. And the amygdala is really important for processing emotional events. And those two are highly interconnected. This is why you tend to remember emotional events much better, things that have an emotional consequence for you, much better than everyday events. And so if you think about things that happened to you in your life, there's going to be the highlight reel is going to be more emotional experiences that you had. And so those emotions trigger a better encoding of memories. That's why you have things like flashbulb memories, which are these seemingly highly detailed memories for very surprising events in our lives. That doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean that you forget things over time. You don't forget things over time, because you do. But certainly those memories tend to be better. So absolutely.
I'm shocked at the situations with me because the moment it's like there's an inflection. I guess the door, walking through the door doesn't necessarily have to be a door. It's some kind of trigger that allows you to kind of shift and then boom, it all just appears.
Right. It doesn't have to necessarily be doorways. We've also shown it with computer windows as well. So whatever defines that location, yeah.
Explain that example. That's your experiment you did with that. Explain that. That's awesome.
With the computer windows? Yeah, so basically had the same thing where we have people walking through doorways to do things, but instead of going through a doorway, we had information on different computer windows, and people had to shift between those windows, and we basically had the same experience. You have also the same thing going on when people read stories. In fact, the whole walking through doorways thing didn't come from me thinking about the world and my experiences forgetting things when I walk through a doorway. It came from understanding narratives, how we comprehend stories that we read about and hear about. And there was a finding in the narrative literature that when there's an event boundary, like a character goes from one location to another, information from the prior location was less available. And so we decided, well, if this happens in the narrative world, does it happen in the real world as well? And that's why we decided to create these virtual environments where people were navigating around. And lo and behold, we found that what we're seeing in the narrative world also applies in the virtual world. And we did it in actual reality as well, and computer windows, all these different places. It shows up all the time. And this sort of resonates with my idea that the reason we have narratives is to allow us to have these vicarious autobiographical experiences, for us to experience the world in ways indirectly that has the same structure and the same memory form, same processes as actual experiences. This is why narratives are so valuable to us. You know, your life story is a narrative. Hearing about other people's stories are narratives. When you read books, when you see films, things of that nature. And the narratives that we're drawn to are the ones that allow us to have experiences that would be difficult to have in the real world, or don't really actually want to have it, but want to have the experience of it, those kinds of stories. So that's why we have the kinds of novels and films that we do, and nobody's watching stories about people in their office typing at the computer.
I would prefer some diversity past superheroes, though. Right now, we seem to have gotten stuck on superheroes. You know.
Well, yeah, they're pretty intense.
Yeah. Hey, listen. Let me kind of shift you into a big philosophical point. This is a quote from you. It's kind of random, but I'm sure it won't feel random to you. But it's a quote from you. It says, "The study of human memory is the closest one can get to a systematic study of the human soul."
Wow.
That's a big line. That's a big line.
Yeah.
I could probably keep you for hours on that one, huh? Why don't you set that up for the audience and explain that sentence, and let's see if we can kind of go down the rabbit hole with it some.
Basically, you know, who are you? You know, I think, who are you as a person? And I'm not using soul here in the theological sense. I think I'm using soul here in the sense of just understanding who you are as a person. Who you are as a person is driven a lot by your experiences. And to know who you are, you have to understand what your memories are, what experiences you've had, what kind of information are you carrying around with you. When you meet somebody, you give this story of what you've been through, and you tell stories about experiences you've had, things of that nature, to give people a feel for what your values are, where you're coming from, what your goals are, things of that nature. We also tell these stories to ourselves to understand, why am I doing this? You know, why am I going on this trip? Why am I want to buy this music? Why am I reading this book? Those kinds of things. That's kind of what I mean by that. By understanding all of the experiences that we've had, that gives us a feel for who we are as people.
Speak to the systematic study, though. The word systematic jumps out at me in that sentence.
We're really good at telling ourselves lots of stories about ourselves, and some of those stories are wrong. You know, sometimes we think that things are going on with ourselves that we're just wrong about. It's just not, doesn't work that way. In order to understand what's really going on with memory, we have to do these scientific studies where we have our experiments, dependent variable, independent variable, control variables, all those good things, so we can really be sure about what it is that's producing the kinds of behaviors that we're observing. It's due to thing X and not due to thing Y. Can we be really certain about it? So one of the examples I give in class is I ask people how they access information in their working memory, which is the stuff that they're currently thinking about. And I give these 3 different possibilities about how it might work. I ask them to raise their hand in terms of which one they think it actually is. And then I show them the data from the actual experiment where they actually assessed how this is going on, looking at response times on the order of tens of milliseconds, things of that nature, what evidence is really being used to support a particular theory. And the theory they pick is, by and large, wrong. 90 to 95% of the students get it wrong. The point of that is that even for things that involve memory very close to conscious awareness, there's a lot going on underneath that we just don't understand. We don't have conscious access to. And we have to do these systematic experiments to test various ideas about what's going on to be sure to actually understand objectively something about the nature of the human condition. What does it really mean to be human apart from our subjective experience about what we think it means to be human, which is sometimes right. I've talked about intuitions before, but sometimes is wrong. There's just a lot going on that we just don't have conscious access to. And I'm glad that, because if we did, then I wouldn't have a job.
Well, yeah, I guess at some point in time, if we figure it all out, we'll just kind of like hook our minds up to a hard drive, and we'll duplicate our minds to a hard drive, and we'll live in virtual reality forever, I guess, to some degree.
I would love that.
I don't know if you've read the book, but there's a book out by a professor named Robin Hanson called The Age of M that goes into this. As we were talking about the systematic study of the human soul and memories coming from experiences. Now, what's difficult here is that, as a scientist, you're kind of like observing, but as you start to observe, it becomes hard not to push students and to push adults further. And what I'm getting there is that the more experiences we have, the more interesting it's going to become for all of us. But if we go down this path, and I think so many people do, they kind of go down the path and they say, okay, we'll do 4 years of college, and then we stop, we go into the quote real world, we get a job, start family, etc. And a lot of that learning and those experiences stop. And I mentioned earlier to you, ending up in Asia for 5 years completely unexpectedly. And it does something to you. It changes something. It shifts things. It's all tied together with the damn topics that you're in the middle of, excuse my bad language. From your situation, like, we really want people to say, you don't stop, keep going, don't quit.
Absolutely. And formal schooling is only one way to do this. Art Kramer has these 3 things he suggests for successful aging. That is to be active intellectually, being active socially, and being active physically. So be active in those 3 areas. That means exposing yourself to lots of different things. If you want to be a good old person in terms of having lots of memories and intellectually healthy, go lots of different places, travel lots of different places, watch lots of different kinds of movies, read lots of different kinds of books, go out and have lots of different experiences, because the more varied and the more intense your memories are in terms of the variety of experiences, the higher level of functioning you're going to be at, so that when things do start to decline, you're not going to see the deficits that you would see in somebody who isn't doing that. So you're starting at a much higher level. I think there's some research by Arthur Shimomura where he tested younger adults and older adults, and some of these older adults were college professors, and the college professors looked just like the younger adults. They didn't really show much in the way of deficits, other than maybe just being a little bit slower. You're exactly right. Do as much as you can. Have as many experiences as you can. That will be one of the best things you can do to improve your memory. For people, as a memory researcher, people always ask me, what can I do to improve my memory? And there's 2 things I tell them. One is write things down, okay, because you're going to forget. And number 2 is have as many experiences, as broad of experiences as you can possibly have, because the more you know, the easier it is to learn, the easier it is to remember. And that can be hard, that can be work, or it can be fun. It's up to you how you want to do it. So you're absolutely right on your assessment of what's going on with yourself.
I'll give one example that it's kind of hard to do, but if you just kind of start a podcast and do it for 6 years and do like 600 plus episodes and talk to like the smartest professors on the planet that are completely outside your discipline, that's a good way too.
Absolutely. Yeah. We should all do that. I mean, that's what I like about the fact that I've never actually left college. I've been here my whole life, talking with these people and having all these interesting conversations.
You just went down the path of aging. I think it's a useful direction to go in our limited time left. And that would be to help people to better understand, what is good aging and memory cognition, and what is, as family members, and we might observe a friend or another family member where something starts to change in a way that's not good. It happens to all of us at some point in time, perhaps. I want to share some of your thought process there in terms of looking for cues that maybe it's not just, someone being tired or whatever, but there's a downfall happening.
First off, successful aging is achieved by doing a lot of things I talked about in terms of being active socially, intellectually, and physically. That's going to keep you sharp. Another big component of aging successfully is attitude. So there's a lot of literature out there that I'm aware of that more you think that your memory or your cognition is going to get worse as you get older, the worse it's going to be. You're going to have trouble. Self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if you tell yourself that I'm older, I'm wiser, I'm smarter, you're going to be doing better than somebody who says, oh, I have all these senior moments and I can't remember. And you're not going to remember. That's one thing. And, even with the walking through doorways thing, when that became more widely known, I was getting a lot of emails from older adults saying, oh, thank God, I thought I was getting old. This happens to everybody. And it's true. When you're older, you forget about how much you forgot when you were younger, and you start attributing it to your age. Now, in terms of things going south, my expertise is not in dementia per se, but you tend to see a greater incidence where people have trouble knowing what the right word is or using the incorrect word or not being able to navigate effectively, especially in new environments, things of that nature. Their ability to segment information into events becomes more difficult. So you start seeing those kinds of problems. Now, the thing about that is that you need some pretty rigorous tests to be able to verify that that's in fact what's going on, and it's not what I mentioned before, is that maybe just getting worried about things. So that can also cause problems. There are some regularities that you do see in people's ability to remember things over the shorter period of time, over for like a minute, days, things of that nature. As well as being able to access general knowledge, like finding words that are needed at a particular moment. And that's going to be maybe an indicator of something that's going wrong.
I have used the line since the age of 19, and I still use it. People say, well, how old are you? I'll say I'm 19. And and I'm not, but it kind of works for attitude in terms of mindset. And I don't want to be 19 with what I knew at 19. I like being my age now and what I know now, but then just saying I'm 19. Let me throw one thing out too, and I would love for your feedback on this. I know that my ability to process or my ability to recall memories, to recall information that I really need dramatically decreases when I'm tired, lack of sleep.
Well, yeah, whenever there's a problem with the system, then things aren't going to work well. So if you're tired and your brain's trying to shut itself down, you're not going to be very effective at retrieving information, unless it was something you learned when you were falling asleep, then it actually might be easier. It's kind of a counterfactual thing. It's like, consuming alcohol. If you consume alcohol and then study, you're actually going to do worse because the alcohol is disrupting your brain's ability to do what it's supposed to do, and so you're not going to learn things very well.
Added to that would be the students that stay up all night thinking they're going to crash study to pass your course. That's not helping them either.
That's not helping at all. I give my students all this really good advice at the beginning of the semester, and they don't listen. We have these intuitions about what works and what doesn't work in terms of our memory, and there's just things that just aren't true. If you study consistently every day, just a little bit of time every day studying whatever topic it is, by the time you get to the final, you know all that information. And if there's some sort of disruption, it's no big deal. You've learned it across time. You learned it better. So spreading learning out improves memory much better than waiting to the end and cramming. And students feel like, well, I'm working really hard when I'm cramming. And they're right. They're working hard because they're not learning anything, because we're not set up to learn things that way. It's a really debilitating and self-harming way to try to learn things. So you're trying to cram all this information in there is not very effective, and you're staying up all night, and so you're tired, and so you make mistakes on the exam. It's just really, really dumb.
I always prefer to not stay up all night and get a good night's sleep and get the F than to stay up all night and get the F.
Yeah, if you're going to get a nap, at least be well rested.
Right, exactly. That made a lot more sense to me. Hey, so as we wind down here, I got kind of a big picture question. You'll have to really kind of jog your mind and what's really your focus right now. But as we talk about these topics, are there major debates in your headspace, so to speak, with colleagues across the globe? Or is it people are generally in agreement about where we are in our understanding right now, memory, cognition, and we're kind of just keep moving down the path? Are there particular thoughts or views out there that cause you discomfort because you think someone, I'm not asking for names, but you think someone has gone a really wrong direction? I can see this in finance, for example, the efficient market hypothesis. Okay, this should not be taught still, but it's still taught. Are there areas in your space where that happens, or are people aligned and getting closer to the truth right now?
I think overall the field is getting more and more accurate ideas about how memory works. But the things that make me angry, personally, is the focus on the here and now, focus on short-term gains, and not having a big picture, which is hard to do. It really is hard to do. I think you need to be more advanced in your understanding of that. But I think the field as a whole doesn't have that. Memory research is very much an effect-driven science at this point. We just don't have enough information to have really big unified theories, which everybody would like to have, but we just don't. We're just not there yet. I get angry when people are really focused in on an effect and not trying to link things together in broader ways, and not looking at what Ebbinghaus taught us, which is that memories change over time. Usually people study something, they get tested, 10, 15 minutes later, an hour later, and then that's it. Whereas for me, I want to know how things are changing over time, because I think that can be very, very useful. One of the things that we should be able to do at this point, which we cannot do, is say how long somebody will remember something reliably. How long will a witness reliably remember what they saw? How long will a student remember something that they heard in the classroom? How long will you remember something that happened on your vacation? And we can't answer those questions. We just throw up our hands and say, well, it depends. And it's true, but it depends on what. And so this is one of the things I start pounding the table in my lab meeting, and people are grabbing their coffee cups and stuff because I'm making things bounce. It frustrates me. I understand why we are where we are, but I would like to see us expand and take this broader view of things. So, and there are some people who are doing that. So it's not like nobody is doing that, but it's just definitely not where the bulk of the work is in human memory. That's my pontification.
Well, you mentioned at the top, with not having the time to really get something done. And it kind of reminds me of something like politicians. I mean, politicians only say what they need to say to get elected. They pretend like there's this big long-term thing. I don't care whether it's left or right. They pretend it's a big long-term thing. That's baloney. They just want to get elected, and it's all short-term nonsense.
Yeah, I think they want to do some things long-term, but they generally don't have the ability. And this gets to the value of tenure. So if you want to look at very long-term things, so things I'm looking at now I'm looking at things that are months out after people learn things. If I'm trying to get tenure, that's a very poor strategy, because if it doesn't work, I'm sunk. And if you're looking for short-term gains, there's just not the time to do that. But because I have tenure, I can take that time. I can look at how things are spinning out over time, look at different angles of things, and not have to rush out, and be more certain about what it is that I'm saying and what are the implications of it. So I'm sort of in the phase of my career where I'm not trying to get as many publications as I can. I'm trying to focus more on getting publications that are going to be cited 20 years after I retire. Things that are foundational, things that are fundamental, things of that nature. And that, for some kinds of science, just takes more time and effort to do that. I understand why young scientists wouldn't necessarily want to do that, because of the way the world is. But we need to be able to take that perspective and know how things fit in that larger picture. We need to look at the forest as well as the trees.
Well, from a personal standpoint, the motivation of trying to leave a legacy, at some point in time, everyone's life, that starts to feel like, hey, gosh, I want to leave something. I want to do something that's going to stand the test of time. Yeah, I get that motivation for sure.
Yeah, it's not about me. It's just I want to be able to, whatever I'm doing is worthwhile, but it's not about me.
Yeah, it's a search for the truth. I mean, it's a search for the truth. That's the only thing that really matters at the end of the day. Because okay, if you're just searching for not the truth, no one's going to remember that at some point in time. The truth is what people remember ultimately, hopefully.
The basic fundamental principles. Yep. The
best website we can send people to check you and your world out. Is there anything you would like to promote? Any beyond a website? Anything you would like to push people in directions? A book or whatnot?
Probably my lab.
You've got
website.
A lot. There's a lot.
Yeah. Just probably my lab website for what I'm doing in particular. Gosh, memory is so fascinating. Somebody who's non-expert, I would encourage them to read Daniel Schachter's books. He covers a lot of basic principles and he has a very good writing style. I would recommend those. That'd be probably my number one.
We didn't get into it today, maybe another conversation. I find one of the things interesting, we're talking about recalling memories. I find, too, that when I can get into that, quote, flow state, that when I get into that state of mind where I forget time and place, the memories just flood back. The information you want to access just floods back, and then you stop doing what you're doing. You look at the clock or the date. Half a day's gone by. You didn't eat. You don't know what happened, but you produced this fantastic piece of work. That's a amazing feeling. I love that every time it happens to me.
Yeah, I wish I could make that happen on demand. That would be nice.
Yeah, we'll leave the audience with that one. Like, how do we make the flow state happen on demand?
Make a lot of money to figure that out.
Absolutely. But, listen, a lot of people probably really don't even have that feeling, is my guess.
Oh, I think they do. It's just so rare. Mm-hmm. It's hard to get into that.
Hey, I appreciate you coming on today. Thank you for educating everyone, including myself.
Thank you, Michael, for calling me.
What a fun conversation today. Ken Blanchard, American author, management expert. His extensive writing career includes over 60 books. His most successful book, The 1 Minute Manager, which I'm sure most everybody listening has read. That one sold over 13 million copies. Absolutely amazing. Anyone who listens to this podcast knows that I really, really, really love having guests on that have seen lots of time on this planet. Because the wisdom, it just comes through. It just exudes in their voice. And that's right there what we have with Ken Blanchard. I'm forever fortunate to keep learning myself. And man, if I can keep having teachers like Ken Blanchard, maybe, just maybe, I'll get a little smarter. Without further ado, let's jump right in. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ken Blanchard. Ken, let me jump right in and go back in time a little bit. I imagine into the early 80s, you released your book, The 1 Minute Manager. But before that, talk to me about an event or a time period in your life, perhaps as a teenager, an experience with family, something that when that book came out and it became a hit, that you knew that some of those early experiences, perhaps an early experience in your teen years, really helped set that foundation. Because I think it'd be fascinating for people to see, for someone who's had such a noted career as you, where was the start? Because it just doesn't happen. There's a lot of building and iterations and steps on top of steps. Where did it all start for you?
Well, it was interesting. I had an amazing father who retired as an admiral in the Navy. He was my leadership coach. I had an interesting upbringing. went to a 95% Jewish elementary school, and on Jewish holidays they put us all in one room, and then we merged in junior high school with a 95% African American elementary school, which went to the Supreme Court in '61 to test the neighborhood school, and I kind of won all the elections as a compromise candidate, and I won the president of the 7th grade, and I was all pumped up, and I came home. It was my first entry into junior high school, and I told my dad, he said, "Congratulations, Ken, but now that you're president, don't ever use your position." He said, "Great leaders are great because people trust and respect them, not because they have power." That was the beginning of my leadership training with him, and so it was really interesting. And so the 1 Minute Manager was really kind of one of those God things, because Margie and I met Spencer Johnson at a cocktail party, and he wrote children's books. He wrote a whole series called Value Tales, the value of honesty, the story of Abe Lincoln, the value of determination, the story of Helen Keller, and the value of sense of humor, the story of Will Rogers. And Margie met him first and hand carried him over to me and said, "You guys ought to write a children's book for managers. They won't read anything else." So he was working on a 1-minute scolding on how to discipline kids, and I invited him to a seminar, and he got all excited and laughed and came running up at the end and said, "Forget parenting, let's do the 1-minute Manager." And since he was a children's book writer, and I was a storyteller because my father taught me how to speak. He said, when you work with a group, you need to make a point, tell a story. Make a point, tell a story. Don't just make point after point and point. You put everybody to sleep.
Can I keep you at your father for a moment? Because the way you describe it initially, your father being an admiral in the Navy, that's something that for most Americans, they don't grow up with that experience. My father was in the Navy during the Vietnam War, but he was a dentist. He was not anywhere near that type of leadership position. I would love for you to give a little bit more, to the extent that you can or you want, about your father, because that's a really interesting, for people that are not familiar with the American military, that's up there. I mean, that's a lot of work to get to that position, many, many years. Can you speak to your father a little bit more, perhaps the influences upon you?
What was interesting about him, he's one of those, what they call great Americans, because he grew up at West Point, where the military academy is, where the Army officers are trained, and his father was a doctor there. And when he got out of high school, his dad said, "I think you should go away to school, son." And he just loved the West Point, and he said, "Well, if I can't go to the Naval Academy, to West Point, I'll go to the Naval Academy." And so he ended up going to where the Navy officers are trained. It was really quite an experience. But he graduated in 24, and World War I ended in 22. That was really kind of a time where they didn't need a lot of naval officers. So after his senior cruise, they let him out. January 25, he goes to Harvard Business School and he gets a master's in finance, an MBA in finance. He goes down to Wall Street and works starting with Anaconda Copper. Then he went with National City Bank. They're about to make him a vice president, and he comes home at 1940. I was 1 year old. Said to my mother, "Well, I quit today." She said, "You did what?" He said, "I quit." She said, "To do what?" He said, "I rejoined the Navy." She said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "Well, didn't I tell you if the country got in trouble, I thought I owed it something, and Hitler's crazy and the Japanese will be in this pretty soon." And so he goes from potential vice president to a second Louis, and they put him in Brooklyn Navy Yard. Pearl Harbor happens, and December 41, looks like he's going to stay there because he's 40 years old with no experience. So that was my dad's style. So he called one of his classmates who had stayed in, was the top guy at the Bureau of Personnel, said, "John, what do you got for an old guy with no experience? I got to get in the action." And he said, "Let me check, Ted." And he called back a couple of days. He said, "All I have with a guy with your experience is a suicide group going into the Marshall Islands." And he said, "You got your man." He, of course, didn't tell my mother, but they gave him 12 LCIs, these landing craft infantry that went right into the beach and protected the Marines and the frogmen, which are the SEALs today. And about 70% of his men were killed or wounded, and somehow he survived, but was decorated off with kind of things that he did. And he came back and went back to National City for a couple of days and came home and told my mother, "Well, I quit again." She said, "Why?" He said, "Oh, a bunch of draft dodgers there." So he stayed in and kept on moving up in rank and, made a whole career out of it, but late, because the wartime bumped his ranks up, because they had to bump him up to give him 12 ships. They made him a Commodore, and then he made him a commander, and then, up the line. But he was an amazing guy, tremendous integrity and values. He said to me, Ken, that, when all is said and done, all you have is your integrity, your word. He just was amazing. And he said, in terms of my work in servant leadership, he said, Ken, it's a myth that in the military it's my way or the highway. He said, because if you acted like that, he said, you were in battle, your men would shoot you before the enemy. He said, I was only as good as the chiefs that I had, the people around me who had all the information and could guide me. And he said, don't think like all the brains are in your office, And so he kept on working me.
How do you think he was, at least as you tell the story, he sounds very even-keeled. A lot of things change in his life. He moves from one thing to the other. He's going down the Navy path, stops, gets back on the Navy path. But speak to that even-keeledness, because I see it in you too.
He really taught me that in life, you never know what might happen, and you got to be ready to go. Like, you want to hear a fun story about me. When I was an undergrad, I got interested I was running a dormitory as a student, as a kind of a resident advisor, and so I got interested in student personnel, being a dean of students, and so that's why I went to grad school, and it was interesting. But all my faculty members, when I was going through my master's degree program, then I said, I'm ready to go to be a dean. They said, well, you need to get a doctor's degree. And I said, doctor's degree? How am I going to do that? Those people are really bright. And so I found that graduate school is more endurance than it is intelligence. A lot of people couldn't make it because you get hit a lot, and you have to know whether you're going to get up. And my dad always told me, somebody hits you, get on up, get on your feet and get going again, don't stay down there and moan and groan. So when I got out of school, they said, if you want to be at a university, you should be an administrator, not a faculty member, because you can't write. So my first job, I ended up being assistant to the dean of the business school at Ohio University. And when I got there, he said, Ken, I want you to teach a course. I want all my deans to teach. And Paul Hersey had just arrived at Ohio U as the chairman of the department. He put me in Hersey's department and gave me a course in management. Well, I had studied leadership and management, so that wasn't any problem. After a week or so, I came home and told my wife, I said, man, this is what I ought to be doing. I ought to be teaching. This is fabulous. She said, well, what about the writing? Because, in universities, if you don't publish, you perish. And I said, I don't know, we'll work that out. But I heard Hersey taught a great course. In December 1966, I go up to him and say, Paul, do you mind if I sit in your course next semester? He said, nobody audits my course. You want to take it for credit, you're welcome. He walked away, and I thought that was really something. But I found out later that he just felt if you audited, you wouldn't do anything, He was really something. So I ended up taking his course and writing the papers. And in June 1967, he comes into my office. Ken, he said, I really would love to have you work with me. He said, they want me to write a book, and I'm kind of a nervous wreck. I'm not so good at that, but I've been looking for a good writer like you. Would you write a textbook with me? And I said, wow, that'll really be fun. You're not supposed to write, and neither am I. So we ended up writing a textbook. It came out a year or so ago, and the 10th edition probably sells more today than it did then. It was really an interesting journey.
Let me jump you ahead a little bit and get you closer to 1982. Your life really probably starts to change dramatically. I mean, maybe your way you carry yourself and the way you think, but in terms of that probably stays the same, of course. But in terms of notoriety, in terms of people knowing what you're doing, your influence on a larger population, this starts to really change with the release of The 1 Minute Manager in 1982, right?
Yes, for sure. What really happened is, who would have ever thunk it, we were a couple of unknown guys. We met in November of 1981 and had a draft written by the time we went to the Rose Bowl in December. And people loved it. And I said to Spencer, let's go to New York and get a contract. He said, no. He said, they'll beat us up and take all the money. They don't know us. he said we ought to self-publish it. So we ended up self-publishing the book ourselves before we went to New York. We sold 20,000 copies with no advertising.
So hold on. So when you went to New York, you had a lot of leverage after selling 20,000 self-published.
Yes, and well, at that time, see, nobody had written any real parables for management at that time. You know, and Spencer and I loved Jonathan Livingston Seagull and The Littlest Prince, and Og Mandino's The Greatest Salesman and all. That's why we thought we'd write a story. He's a children's book writer, and I'm a storyteller, so let's write a parable, you know. We didn't realize what an impact that would have because people were tired of reading long books. And you get a kick out of this. Year before, all the bestsellers were about Japanese management. And I think the U.S. market was just tired of that. What about us? The 1 Minute Manager came out at the same time as Tom Peters and came out with In Search of Excellence, and John Nesbitt came out with Megatrends, and the three of us dominated the bestseller list. The business books had never done that.
Let me ask, were you able to, I assumed, but having pre-sold those copies before going to New York, were your conversations and your negotiations different when you got to the big publishers in New York City? Did you truly have some leverage?
Yeah, because we had a track record. We already had endorsements from corporation presidents, and so we were at a different kind of league. But it was funny. We were selling the book for $15.95, you know, and it wasn't even 100 pages long. And one of the publishers, no, the price is too high, you know. And Spencer would kind of get up and go to the door and look at these people. He said, "This must be Little League, because if two unknown guys can sell 20,000 at $15.95 and you can't, we got the wrong publisher." And, and when we got to William Morrow, when he gave his little speech, the president of Morrow, Larry Hughes, jumps up and says, "Lock the door, don't let him out of here. He's absolutely right. We got to figure this out, you know." We put a little thing on the front of the book that said, "Small, expensive, but invaluable." Just so people knew that we knew it was a high price in those days, you know, but that was a hardback for $15.95. Today it'd probably be $25 or $30.
Let me ask about the title, because this is an interesting title. I think even for today, if someone has not yet read the book, or if they hear the title, 1 Minute Manager, that brings up ideas in people's craniums that they probably get it wrong just instinctively, because the title doesn't tell you what it really is. So talk to me about the development of the title and perhaps any confusion that you saw early on were people debating the title with you?
No, well, Spencer was working on this thing called the 1 Minute Scolding with a psychiatrist. When he came running up after that, said, "Forget parenting, do the 1 Minute Manager." And we thought, wow, that's really neat, because what really sells books is to intrigue people. And you say, the 1 Minute Manager, well, how could you manage in a minute? I'd really like to see what they have to say about that. And I think the title was on our on our radar really well.
Why don't I let you go ahead also, for the audience that has not yet read, or those that need a reminder, there were really 3 very key, simple secrets that really drove your book. Why don't you speak to those?
We kind of looked at, what are the key things to managing people? And the first one was 1 minute goal setting. All good performance starts with clear goals. If people don't know what you want them to do, how are they going to end up doing it? 1 minute goal setting was the first secret. But once goals are clear, we thought you ought to wander around and see if you can catch people doing something right and accent the positive and give them a 1 minute praising. I tell you, of all the things I've ever taught over the years, if somebody said to me, "Blanchard, I'm going to take everything away from you, but one thing," the one thing I would hold on to is 1 minute praising, because I think that if you want to build a great organization or have great people, you got to catch people doing things right.
Yeah, and you were talking about the 1 minute praisings, and is that something that to not take away from you?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's just so important, So many organizations, I ask people, how do you know whether you're doing a good job? Nobody's yelled at me lately. No news is good news. Unfortunately, the biggest style around the world is what I call seagull management. The manager's not around until you make a mistake, and then they fly in, make a lot of noise, dump on everybody, and fly out. Not a really fun place to be. And so I think if you're in an environment that accents the positive, people want to be there. But if people make a mistake, you shouldn't ignore it. We said the third secret is the 1-minute reprimand. Now, we've rewritten the book recently, a couple of years ago. We changed that to 1-minute redirects. But either way, it was really saying to the person, here's what I've noticed about your performance. It's not up to the what we agreed upon. And I want to know if you're noticing that too. And I'd like to see if I could help you get back in line. It's really more of a redirection than a reprimand, but Spencer really kind of liked the concept of a reprimand with his 1-minute scolding.
Ken, speak to the time component here at 1 minute. Speak to the shortness in terms of praise or reprimand. Now, I think instinctively we would all think, well, gosh, nobody wants to be reprimanded for longer than it has to be. 1 minute sounds good to me. 1 minute praise also, well, that seems a little more less instinctive because, well, hold on. If somebody wants to give me praise, I'll take it for a lot longer than a minute. Not necessarily a good idea, huh?
No, it's just, how long does it take you to really notice, somebody and say, I just want to tell you, I just noticed what you do, and boy, it really made me feel good, and I just appreciate your efforts. And you don't want to go on and get super gushy, but you want to be specific, tell them what they did right, but you don't have to, do that. And so you could wander around and give a number of praisings because Tom Peters always said the key to being a great manager is to manage by wandering around, I think the myth about how long it takes to reprimand or redirect somebody and all is just it's a myth. It doesn't have to be a long one, but as long as you're specific, it was funny. I had one guy that at the holiday season now, he would go around his company and shake hands with everybody in the company and just say, just appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot. And he would go on to the next person, appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot. And he got sick one holiday season. He couldn't make the round, so a guy put a mask on and went around and said to people, appreciate your efforts, thanks a lot and all. And everybody just laughed because it didn't have any meaning, because he didn't know anything about what anybody was doing, It was just kind of like a shower. You got to be specific. And when you're specific, that's really powerful for people.
Let me take it big picture for a moment and get away from some of the specifics. I'm going to bring you back there too in a moment. But big picture, great managers are trained, not born. I see this in my field too, in the investments field. People wonder about great investors. You can even think of somebody like Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger. It all is about training. I think across all disciplines. If you ask people about natural talent, or if there's such a thing, it seems like the vast majority of people reach for, well, that guy is a natural investor, or he's a natural manager, or he's a natural athlete. But you speak to the idea of training. And I think it's something that as a society, we've all gotten a little messed up on, that if you really want to go down the path of any path, and you push and push and push, and you practice and practice and practice, you can excel. How do we get that all wrong?
People say, are good leaders born or they made? It's a combination. I mean, I will say some people, like my dad, just had a natural flair for people. He loved people, and he could bring out the best in them. Now, he said he learned.
Who did he learn from, though, right?
Yeah. Well, he learned at the Naval Academy.
There you go.
Most of us really could use some training. I think people need to, first of all, know what leadership is, practice it, wander around and try to do it and model it and all. And it's a journey. So I think training can really help people, and you can become better. We have a master's degree program at the University of San Diego, and it's in leadership, and the students are all in their mid-30s and higher, and they say, wow, I wish I had learned some of this sooner, because a lot of times we assume that a good performer, somebody's a good salesperson, will be a good sales manager. That's not necessarily so, because that's a completely different trait. Being an individual contributor is different than managing people. that's where the training has to come in, and so people can see things differently.
I would love for you to at this moment to give a little perspective on constant learning, because we're covering some decades here, and you've never stopped. You just keep going, and you keep learning, and you keep growing. And the question I have is why? I
wrote a book with Norman Vincent Peale, wrote The Power of Positive Thinking. He was 86 years old when I wrote with him. I was in my early 40s. Norman said, if you stop learning, lie down and let them throw the dirt on you because you're already dead,
I love it.
And I just never forgot that, because he was learning right up to when he died at 95. And he's been a great inspiration for me. I'm 78 now, and people said, when are you going to retire? I said, why would I retire? I'm having too much fun. I'm learning too much stuff and all. And I just think that I wrote a book with Mark Miller, was the head of training at Chick-fil-A, called Great Leaders Grow. And we just were arguing because we've just really seen that the best leaders we've seen are people who are constantly trying to get better and learn. And I think you need to. I wrote a book recently called Refire, Don't Retire. Make the rest of your life the best of your life, And I was on the phone when I turned 65 with, remember Zig Ziglar? Ziggy invited Margie and I to the 69th anniversary of his 21st birthday or something. And I said, Ziggy, you going to retire? He said, there's no mention of it in the Bible, except for Jesus, Mary, and David. Hardly anybody under 80 made an impact. He said, I'm refiring, not retiring. I thought, wow, that really is powerful. And so I ended up writing a book about that. And what's so interesting is I thought it mainly would be for senior citizens, and they were giving it to all their kids in their 20s and 30s who they thought were getting in a rut. And it was really exciting. I just think it's so important to learn. And in the Refire book, we look at 4 areas for learning. What are you doing to grow intellectually with your mind? That's really important. What are you doing to grow physically? Keep yourself in shape and all that. What are you doing spiritually? Because you ought to, get out of your own way and realize maybe you're not the most important thing in the world. And then finally, what are you doing around relationships? It's a constant thing of keep on refiring yourself, and so I'm really excited about refiring. My wife, is a little year younger than I am, but she used to be president of the company, and she stepped down a number of years ago because I came up with a belief with a guy from Europe who I was writing a book with, Terry Waghorn, that you really have to do 2 things in organizations. You have to manage the present and create the future. And you make a mistake in an organization to send people who have present responsibilities off to plan your future, because they'll kill your future because they're either overwhelmed with the present or have vested interest in it. You ought to have a separate group that's in charge of the future. So my wife stepped down as president. She got a think tank of group that had no operational responsibility. A full-time job was to study our industry, study technology, and all. And so it's been tremendous advantage for us over the years. When 9/11 happened, a lot of our competitors had real problems because they only did face-to-face training. Well, we knew all about online training and all kinds of stuff because of the Office of the Future. So that's that. And so she's an amazing learner. She's always, turning another rock over.
It's one of those reminders that everyone needs to hear, that somebody that is a few years older has never stopped. And so then if somebody's much younger and they say, I've learned enough. No, you haven't. You can't stop. If you want to compete with the best, you got to keep going. That's the way it works. I've got this, I've most recently gone through your book, Self-Leadership and the 1 Minute Manager. And there's 2 quotes in there that I love. They kind of connect. An assumed constraint is a belief that limits your experience, and not realizing your own power could be your greatest assumed constraint. Why don't you first talk about the notion of an assumed constraint?
We kid, and the environmentalists have been picking on the elephants in the circus and all, but it's really interesting, when they first get an elephant, they tie him up to a stake and a rope, and the elephant tries to pull and can't do it. They're not strong enough. And now the elephant's huge and thinks they can't pull the stake up. They could pull that stake out in a heartbeat, but it's an assumed constraint from the past, And I think that's what you have to do, is you have to watch the messages that people give you, that they, kind of label you what you can do, just like people saying, I'm sorry, you can't write. And that was the consume constraint until I realized that was stupid. How do I move through that? Rather than not being able to write, that's just become one of my favorite things. I think consume constraints are often, messages put in your head by your parents and other adults when you were young. So that's where it all starts. And once you got that under control, then we say, well, most people are afraid to ask for what they need to win because they don't think they have any power. They assume that if the boss has power, a coach has power and all this kind of thing. They don't realize that we all have power. If people like to be around you, you have personal power. If you're good with technology, you have technical skill and power. And if, there's a whole bunch of it. So we try to have people look at what kind of power bases they have and how do they increase them. And then finally, the last one is, how do you ask for what you need? We use our situational leadership model to help them analyze what's their development level and how do they get the help that they need to succeed, And so it's fun. I use that on my own health. When I got Joy, and she was such a joy in my life, this dog, and I realized that she's small. She probably lasted 16, 17 years. And by the time that was, I'd be 86, 87, and she gets so excited. She can tell my car's coming down the road even before I get in here. She comes racing down the hall, and I didn't want her to be racing down the hall, and I wasn't going to be there, A lot of people say, Blanchard, you're something. Most people worry about losing their dog, not their dog losing them. But so I decided to get myself in shape, and I went to a guy I met at West Point. It's one of the heads of their whole physical fitness training, and he told me that there's 6 parts of healthy lifestyle, and one is aerobic, what are you doing for your heart? Then there's strength training, then there's balance, flexibility, diet and weight control, and sleep. And so I went through and looked at what was my development level, and the only one I was fully developed on is sleep. I can sleep at the drop of a hat, But the other ones, I had to look for somebody who would give me the leadership style I needed. So, like, I had never done anything with strength training, so I needed a lot of direction and supervision. In aerobic, I had been in a lot of different jogging programs and all, and so I really needed somebody to support me, and I needed a walking partner, a running partner. You got to do it. We say to people, if you ask somebody to help you and they say they can't, they didn't turn you down. They just turned your proposition down. Nobody can turn you down without your permission. Eleanor Roosevelt said that years ago. Nobody can make you inferior without your permission.
It's so beautiful to hear just that common sense wisdom. And you just say it and you hear it. It's reminders that we don't hear in everyday society anymore. In everyday society, all we hear about, if you turn on the news, is the latest who knows what crazy behavior of some politician or some Hollywood person did. That's all we ever hear about. We don't hear about the common sense good stuff.
That really is a problem, I think, in our country, and I think around the world. You don't ever hear any good news. And some people say it's our fault because we don't want to listen to good news, but I did a session recently for a group called First Tee, and they teach kids in urban areas about character and values through golf, And they've impacted in 20 years 10 million kids. And you should have heard the stories that I heard from these kids about what's happened in their life. I said, how come I never heard of this thing? What a great new story this is.
Wouldn't it be nice on the nightly news, the ABC, NBC, CBS, instead of starting with the daily news of whatever, just start with that story? I think people would love it. Yeah.
We love the Sunday morning news, CBS morning news, with that good gal, because that's all that is good news. So we watch that before we go to church. Jane Pauley runs that. But it really is true, even in our country now with President Trump, he's got some issues and problems and all, but nobody's caught him doing anything right.
Yeah. Let me shift you into, Ken, as we wind down. We've only got so much time left. Self-leadership. I can tell you something about myself. I'm in my late 40s, 50s soon, and I'm a guy that grew up at the start of the internet. So right there when Netscape was going public, I was like, okay, I'm just getting out of grad school. I've got nothing. I'm putting up a website. Boom. So my thinking all along has been this entrepreneurial thinking, not be associated with a large company. And I have to say, there was probably some hesitation in me in diving into your world because I thought, well, gosh, why is this going to be useful for me? Because this is more large corporate management leadership. I dive into your world and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we all need, regardless of, whether or not you're self-leadership or whether with a large company. It's what we all need.
I think people that don't admit that they need this have an ego problem. I started a 12-step Egos Anonymous program, where people get focused either in false pride where they think more of themselves than they should, and they're putting people down, or self-doubt and fear where they think less of themselves than they should, and they're kind of cowering and all that kind of thing. And I just think that, as we were saying earlier, if you stop learning, you're in trouble. You just need to open your mind and say, and that's the same way. The great leaders I've seen, I wrote a book with Colleen Barrett, who stepped in to be president of Southwest when Herb Kelleher decided to step down. And she has a great saying. She said, "Ken, people admire your skills, but they love your vulnerability. And to admit that you don't know everything, that you could learn something. I mean, rather than people saying, God, he's the leader, how come he's so dumb? They're going to go, wow, isn't that great? Now I can make a contribution and all." And Brene Brown, who's a really big person now in our country, she did a TED Talk on vulnerability. And God, I don't know how many millions and millions of people watched that thing to realize that being vulnerable is not a weakness. It's actually a strength. In fact, she says it takes courage.
It's a fascinating path you've gone down. I would love for you to reach back into the memory banks. I know you've had a chance to inspire so many people with your wisdom, your vulnerability, your content. But are there any particular people? They don't have to be a well-known name. It could be somebody. Because I know with your type of career, you've shifted other careers. You've allowed people to build off your work and go in directions that perhaps they didn't expect if they had not come across your work. Are there any great stories or individuals that you can recall that you really feel so proud that or happy that they found you, they found your work, and then they took it and they built off it and went in such a great direction? Look, I know it's more than one person, but I'm curious if you've got any in mind that might be fun to share with the audience.
I started to work, and we started to work with Ken Chenault, president of American Express, when he wasn't president. And then the minute he became president, he continued to work with us. In fact, when we would do a new sermon or a new seminar or learning experience, he'd always be the first one in the first row. And he's just retiring now, and everybody's saying, God, he's got to be one of the great CEOs of all time. And I think it's not because he got trained by us, because he got trained by a lot of people, but his openness to learn and to realize that he still could learn new things and all that. I mean, he's one that really kind of stands out on me, and he African American, the probably highest ranked African American CEO in the country, and just unbelievable openness to learning, and I think that's a really exciting stuff, and look at Herb Kelleher and Colleen Barrett from Southwest. They're always open to new learning, and there's no accident that Southwest is the only airline that's made any money over the years. A lot of people don't know they're 87% union. It's the biggest union shop in the country. But when they were going to vote on unions, they came to Herb and he said, God, I love unions as long as they let you sit on the same side of the table from me. Is that they want you to sit in the opposite table, vote against them. And the union leaders are there at every meeting I've ever been, even voting to salary cuts to deal with the gas crisis. And, I just really see them, as models of saying, well, I don't know anything. I need everybody. I need all of you to be the best. I just love of that stuff. I've worked with Wegmans grocery chain. They were chosen the number one company in the to work for in the country by Fortune, and just amazing. I was asked to speak when the founder stepped down and his daughter was going to take over, and at her first big meeting, and the founder decided not to come. He said, "I don't want to take anything away from her. She's in charge now. She's the leader," and all. I mean, how many people would do that? The absolute best leaders are the ones that Greenleaf, talked about. Robert Greenleaf, he said that they serve first and lead second.
Ken, I have one final question, and it's kind of a wider issue beyond America. We mentioned in the beginning of the conversation Singapore, and I know your books have been translated. I think the number I'm seeing most recently is 42 languages, but it probably goes up every day. I would love for you to kind of contrast and compare. I find, having been outside the States for multiple years, I find in some of the growing, vibrant cities around the world, I find an energy that sometimes I think we as Americans, maybe we've dialed it back a little bit, because I find the enthusiasm in some really growing areas outside the States. It's quite amazing. I'm curious if you would talk about the acceptance of your work outside the States. Obviously, I mentioned the translations, but the personal experiences you've had with the acceptance of your work.
I was on a program one time with Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, and he's a perfect example of managing consequences, because he had a vision for Singapore and what he wanted that country to be, and he said, here's our goals and here's what good behavior looks like. And I don't want our streets to be all messy and all. So if you litter and you're caught, it's a $500 fine. If you don't have the money on you, you go to jail, he was, and yet when people were really good, he would praise them and all that kind of thing. It's just, that's why 1 minute goal setting is the first secret. You need to set a vision and a goal of what, and then catch people doing things right. And if they don't do it right, then redirect their energy. And I've just been amazed every time I've been in Singapore about what a wonderful place to be, and the positive energy in that place, and a lot of different nationalities and all living there. And it's just great. So when you see that in a country, it's really exciting, and so I think that's the kind of thing that we need more of.
I find when I talk with my Singaporean entrepreneurial friends, it's the closest kinship that I have in terms of that business conversation than with Americans. I mean, they're right there, if not beyond. You bring up Lee Kuan Yew, something, a cool point for people to check out. There are some old black and white Meet the Press interviews that you can find on from NBC on YouTube, where he's speaking in the 60s. Fantastic oratory, just great.
Yes, unbelievable, and you see that, like Rwanda, where they had this genocide, and 20 years ago, and then they got a different leader, and that whole thing is turned around. Rick Warren's over there and all kinds of things. I mean, that's becoming one of their goal is by 2025 that they might be, the Singapore of Africa, just change the leader. Look at Colombia was really a problem. Then they got a new leader, and Colombia's just really turned around tremendously, and the leader has got to be somebody who has vision. And also, it's not about them. They're not building themselves up. It's interesting. Jim Collins, when he did his study at Good to Great, he studied 25 or, a bunch of companies that we found were really great companies, and hardly anybody knew the leader, the president. It wasn't about them. It wasn't the Iacocas or the others that, are out front all the time. It's really interesting to see that, whether it's in a nationwide or in a business-wise, that the leaders who have vision, and it's not about them, it's about the people they're serving. What a difference that makes.
Ken, I can't keep you. I could ask you questions all day long. You need to go enjoy that San Diego sunset. hang out and relax some. But I appreciate you taking the time today. Great stuff. We covered a lot of wide territory. I'm most appreciative. Is there a place, Ken, for the books everywhere, Ken Blanchard, Amazon, you're going to find a ton of reading there. A best website that people can go to, Ken?
So we have a new website called KenBlanchardBooks.com. Yeah, a lot of people will say, God, I'd like to see all that. We got them divided, whether you're interested in customer service or self-leadership or team leadership.
Are you still keeping track of how many books you've written, Ken?
Well, other people are, but I haven't paid attention. It's supposedly over 60. But
60?
My mother used to say, why don't you write a book by yourself? And out of those 60, I've only written 2 by myself, one on golf, because so many people helped my golf game, I didn't know who to write it with, and the other one was my spiritual journey. But I'm a learner, and I just love to learn from other people. So every other book I've co-authored with somebody, and so that's just a delight to me. I have a book coming out in March. It's probably the best thing I've ever done. It's called Servant Leadership in Action, and I got 41 people to write short articles about what servant leadership meant to them, from people like Marshall Goldsmith and Francis Hesselbaum, who ran the Girl Scouts, and all kinds of great people, Kuznets and Posner, and even Dave Ramsey, and just an amazing group of people who are Lencioni and all that. They did it because I'm a collaborator. I'm not a competitor. So it's really fun. It's coming out in March. And I think the world is in desperate need of a different leadership role model. And I just hope that this is a movement, not a book. And the royalties are all going to a servant leadership foundation where we're trying to build energy to send it around the world.
Well, Ken, you're a great inspiration, and I feel fortunate to have had you on. And if in the future, if you would ever like to have another conversation when the servant leadership book comes out, I'd love to have you on again.
God bless.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.